Welcome to another episode of Taking Down Trump. I'm your host, Tristan Snell. We've got a lot to talk about this week as the election rumbles on toward its conclusion, including Trump's interesting 30-minute musical interlude at one of his rallies recently. And we're going to take a look at the state of Georgia because it serves as a microcosm for a lot of the issues surrounding voting and election law and early voting in particular. And I think it's a great place for us to look at when we think about the battles that loom ahead as we see what will happen in November and beyond, as we hopefully will get to see a victory for democracy and actually getting that victory implemented through our clunky constitutional system that needs reform in a big way. But first, let's talk about a couple of other stories that are big this week in the areas of law and politics. First, breaking news as we tape this, there has been a fantastic measure out of the government in Washington. There have been a lot of fantastic measures from the Biden and Harris administration, but what's wonderful about this is that it's so freaking simple and just one little thing that's going to make such a big difference in people's lives. You know, the Inflation Reduction Act, huge, wonderful results coming out of that, the bipartisan infrastructure bill. But those things, you're not going to go and read them, right? Because they're like giant books, very, very large pieces of legislation regarding everything from bridge construction to clean energy. But this is just one little rule we can all wrap our heads around. It's going to make a big difference. A simple rule that says that any subscription, whether that's online or physical location, has to have a one-click to cancel button. That's amazing. Okay. And just think of that. That's not just your Netflix and your other streaming services and all the other things you sign up for and then are like, oh my gosh, that thing's been billing me forever. How about gym memberships? Whoa. Like this could get really amazing really quickly. Okay. Think about all the times that you've gotten the runaround on this. It's like, oh, you've got this menu. You've got to email that address. You've got to click here 5 times, do blah, blah, blah. You got to send in your blood sample and some DNA and know your mother's, daughter's, sister's, cousin's, mother's, dog's maiden name, all this other crap that they make you do. Right. And to actually have a system whereby you just click one button and it's gone. Then think about gyms, which often what they do is just tantamount to straight up fraud, okay, with how they make it impossible to cancel. This is a huge change, and it was done by the Federal Trade Commission via a rule that now goes out for public comment. It gets published. There's a whole process that is entailed with all of that. It will take effect, hopefully, in 180 days, in 6 months. But that was announced today. And this is a really wonderful measure from the Biden and Harris administration. And what we have to hope for now, and one of the reasons why I'm making sure to tell everybody about this, is that we all need to fight for this now. We all need to make our voices heard with our members of Congress, even though this is the FTC. Make sure the FTC hears from you, but also make sure we should all be getting in there now that this is a published rule. But we also need to be getting in there to make sure that our members of Congress are on this as well. And I will probably be posting on my Twitter and on my Substack about exactly who we should be reaching out to in this regard. But we need to make sure that we defend this rule and that we do everything we can to make it stick, because there's going to be efforts to tear it down. There's a lot of vested interests that they make a lot of their money by simply making it difficult to cancel their shit. Okay. And we got to change that. This is a long time coming. It gets back to what I always say with consumer protection is that there's lots and lots and lots of wonderful businesses out there, but a lot of businesses face a moral choice and they end up on one side or the other. You can take care of people or you can take advantage of people. And it's really two opposing business models. And you can very clearly see which companies fall into which bucket. Are they really delivering value for money? Did they do something innovative? Did they do something delightful? Did they just execute better on whatever it is that they do, whatever good or service it is that they provide? And you're happy to pay for it because they're awesome. Or are they there to trick you, trap you, and then hold you there because you can't get out? And that's the latter group. That's the take advantage of you group. And that's a very big part of the economy. And sometimes there are businesses that do a little bit of both. They deliver a bit of value up front, but then they make sure that they trap you there afterwards and just don't let you go. And sometimes the dazzle you with delight company kind of rots and degrades and turns into one of these trick and trap and defraud you companies later on. Okay. I think we can think of plenty of those in the tech world. They started off looking like they were really doing a wonderful service for all of us, but then more and more it just became a way to trick and trap us and hold us there. What if there's a better way to make sure that we can escape from these companies and from these services and from these subscriptions? Wonderful little change, a very relatively small rule that I think is going to have a relatively huge impact on our daily lives as consumers. One of the best consumer protection measures that I think we've seen in quite some time. Next up in some other news, turning to politics completely for a moment, we've had not only the presidential race, but it's time to take a look at some of the Senate races. We're going to be focusing on more of the Senate and House races as we get closer and closer to Election Day coming up. But for today, we're going to talk about two of the big Senate races that I think have had some interesting developments pop up. Those are in Missouri and Texas. Now, these have not been the ones that the mainstream media folks have been talking about because they seem obsessed with finding all the places where Democrats are in trouble or Democrats are going to lose or Democrats are in disarray because that's their go-to move to the hoop, right? Let's talk about some of the places where there are some Republicans that are in deep trouble, and a lot of it is because they have been such outspoken loudmouths and supporters of insurrection. And I'm talking about Josh Hawley and I'm talking about Ted Cruz. Both of them have been coming under fire more in the last week. Hawley, it turns out, he's been racing around Missouri by private jet. He's not getting around via pickup truck or bus or anything like that. No, he's flying around his supposed home state in a private jet. I also want to know how he's getting to Missouri in the first place, because as we know, longtime listeners will note that he doesn't live in Missouri. Josh Hawley does not have a bona fide legal residence in Missouri as he is required to do by the Constitution of the United States of America. He instead has his primary residence in Virginia and has been using his sister's lake house in the Ozarks as his Missouri address, which, by the way, is probably also voter fraud, but let's just put that aside for a second. So again, we get to a place where Hawley's just cosplaying as a red state senator. That's the real issue here. And Ted Cruz, very much the same, right? Every time he gets an opportunity, he's gone the hell out of Texas, whether it's leaving for Cancun when there's massive winter storm and power outage, or when there were other storms recently, he had conveniently managed to jet off to Asia. It was a pre-planned trip, but I'm sorry, if there's a natural disaster hitting a state I represent as a senator, I'm staying home. I'm staying home to take care of the people of my state. Where the hell are you, Ted Cruz? Chicken hawk running around talking about trying to save the country in January 6th, rah, rah, rah. When the punches started flying and the weapons came out and the Capitol Police were under assault and representatives and senators like him were actually under physical threat from the mob that they helped incite, Hawley, famously on the security cam footage, tried to run away. Earlier in the day, he has his fist up. An hour or so after that, he's running for the exits because he doesn't want to get beat up or killed by the mob. Where was Ted Cruz? He was hiding in a supply closet, cowering. That's what he was doing. Okay. So, and this came out during the debate that he had with Democratic challenger Colin Allred the other night. These are people who do not deserve to be anywhere near the United States Congress, the United States Senate. They don't deserve to be there. Okay. Let's not even talk about the rest of their other policies, but they don't actually stand up and stand behind the states, the people that they supposedly represent. They're running off and running away at every opportunity. They don't actually want to live in the states that they supposedly represent in the Senate. They want to be anywhere other than Texas and Missouri. They don't want to be there because they're off jet setting. Okay. They're not there at the grocery store. They're not there helping victims of a natural disaster. They're off gallivanting around, enjoying fame and fortune as a member of the U.S. Senate and living high on the hog. That's what they're doing. When the danger actually did come to them and they couldn't get away to Cancun or to Tokyo and couldn't get away on a private jet, they ran away and they hid from the very mob that they supported. So on that basis alone, get those bastards out of there. Send them home. They shouldn't be there. And hopefully that's the very thing that voters do. Again, the mainstream media is not really looking at these two races as being, and I include with that the pollster industrial complex, the ratings for whether it's a toss up or a blah, blah, blah. I really believe that there is inadequate polling for a lot of these things. The polling that does take place is disproportionately from right-wing outfits or from mass media outlets that want to show things being tighter than they are for the presidential race. And I don't think that a lot of them are really paying attention to a lot of the Senate races where there's a conventional wisdom that it's a Republican seat and it's not going to get taken. I don't believe that we're getting the accurate sense of what's really going on in these states. And again, I don't think we're seeing a lot of mainstream coverage of these races, but keep an eye on them because I think that there could be something happening here. As I suspect overall, I believe that Harris's lead nationally and in swing states is being terribly underreported. And I think that the pollsters have had a Republican lean the past 5 to 8 years because they've been scared of undercounting Republicans after so many of them got burned in 2016. But ever since then, pretty much every time there's been a real election, Democrats have done better than the polls. And again, I don't think that we're seeing a lot of mainstream coverage of this, but I think these are going to be two states to really keep a closer eye on as we head toward Election Day. Another state we're going to be focusing on is Georgia coming up later in the show. But when we come back first, let's talk about that weird Trump rally. Welcome back. And one of the other stories from this past week that I know everybody already knows about, but I think is just an interesting place as a starting point for further discussion, is the extremely weird rally that Donald Trump held the other night in Pennsylvania, wherein it was supposed to be a town hall with a Q&A with his rabid fans. And instead, he took only a few questions and then abruptly stopped, did not seem to understand exactly what the run of show was supposed to be and what music he was supposed to exit to. Kristi Noem was like trying to kind of help him along here. And when she's your voice of reason and the one who looks sane on the stage, you've got a massive problem. I think another thing that's true here is that, Donald Trump's lucky that she didn't think of him more like one of her dogs, because last time somebody glitched that badly in front of her, she made sure the creature was shot. No, he all of a sudden just seemed to stop. He didn't seem to understand what was going to happen next, ordered that music be turned on, stopped doing any Q&A, and then proceeded to dance. I'm not going to use the word dance, kind of sway awkwardly to the music with some hand gestures of various sorts, awkwardly for 30 minutes, right? We've seen the footage. I mean, first off, as plenty of people have noted, myself among them, if Joe Biden had done anything even remotely resembling this, right? It wouldn't have just been the calls to drop out of the race that he ultimately did heed. And yes, that all worked out for the best, but that doesn't mean that it was the thing that should have been forced upon him at the time, right? We can't do all of this with 2020 hindsight. But okay. The double standard is the thing that really still gets me, okay? Anything that Biden did, it was like, oh, he's unfit. Oh, he can't be in the race anymore. Oh, whatever. Donald Trump didn't quite look as bad as Mitch McConnell in that press conference, where it looks like McConnell might have had some sort of medical episode mid-press conference. He didn't look cool. He didn't look that bad, but it didn't look good. It looked like something happened there. Like all of a sudden he just lost the thread. And I'm not trying to do this with glee or anything like that. I don't want to see anybody suffer. People getting older and having medical issues is awful, okay? It's not a fun thing. I'm not trying to gloat over this. It's actually more like how we're still seeing the double standard here, where Biden just got shoved out unceremoniously, and yet the entire mainstream media wants to sane wash everything that Donald Trump does. And there's nothing at all from them, where they're making the choice to cover about his age, his mental faculties. Where is it? We still haven't seen it. It is quantifiable. The hundreds, the thousands of stories that these outlets did on Joe Biden, and yet they barely ever bring it up with Donald Trump. And it's plain as day. It's staring us right in the face. I want the man to go spend the rest of his days with perfectly good medical care in a very nice federal penitentiary where he belongs and be able to enjoy some semblance of a retirement. Realistically, it would be at some sort of minimum security, rather cushy prison if he ever gets to one, which I still hope he will. But that's what the man deserves. I'm not wishing ill upon him. I'm just wishing him to be someplace where we're not, and where he actually has accountability for the crimes that he has committed, including trying to overthrow the government of the United States. And I don't want him running for president, A, because he's a felon and an insurrectionist and a bully and a sexual assaulter, all of those things. It's also because then we have somebody coming into the White House who is seemingly another episode or two away from being incapacitated or worse. And then we get J.D. Vance as president, and that should scare everybody, maybe even more than Donald Trump, because to have someone younger with a full use of his faculties, fewer, if any, scruples, who's been completely bought. J.D. Vance didn't inherit hundreds of millions of dollars from his dad, so he's been totally at the complete mercy of folks like Peter Thiel. He's completely bought and sold, whereas Donald Trump, he had some money in there of his own. It looks like he's been probably taking money or getting some help from outside people too. But if you want to talk about compromised, J.D. Vance is your poster boy. He'll literally do anything for a buck or another ounce of power, right? He first got his claim to fame by selling out his own family, including his mom and his grandparents and the entire town, all his neighbors, all his friends where he grew up, painted them horribly just so he could sell some books. So this isn't exactly a warm and fuzzy, cozy kind of guy, okay? But we've already talked plenty about Vance. Back to Trump. The sane washing is absolutely out of control, but there's a reason behind it that we all really have to talk about. The giant elephant in the room, besides Trump's age, is why the mainstream media isn't covering it. And it's because Donald Trump makes them money. In 2015, I attended a presentation by a former newspaper executive who had a whole bunch of numbers and a really fine set of arguments and showed beyond the shadow of a doubt that the newspaper industry was in a death spiral and would be collapsing within 5 years or so. That was in 2015. It was in the early summer of 2015. This was a few months before our unfortunate golden escalator moment where Donald Trump commenced his run for president. Ever since then, the news media has been riding a giant wave of revival. Okay. They've had the clicks, they've had the ratings, they've had the subscriptions. It's been there for them. It reinvigorated an entire industry that was on its way to oblivion. If there is somebody who single-handedly bailed out your business, are you going to bite that hand that feeds you ever? No, you're going to treat them with kid gloves. I don't know if these folks at the New York Times or at any of the TV networks get up in the morning and say, how are we going to sane wash Donald Trump today? How are we going to keep him relevant? How are we going to make this race look closer than it is so that we can have more clicks and more things? And they'll will it into being. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If they say often enough that it's a close race, they turn it into more of a close race. It has its own effect when they do this. I don't know that they wake up every morning and think about how they're going to do this, but I know there's unconscious bias there. These people have a vested interest in Donald Trump continuing to be extremely competitive because it has been selling advertisements for them. It's been getting them subscribers. And the second that Donald Trump fades from the national scene, finally, their business models are going to swan dive. It is going to be ugly what happens to them. They know this. And so they are desperately trying to keep this party going for as long as possible because they know that the cops are coming away to shut it down at some point, and it's over. And it's never going to be this good again for them. So remember that the next time you're seeing this disparity in the coverage. Why are they not talking about Donald Trump being unfit to serve? Because they desperately need him to be in there because it props up their entire business model. That is why we are seeing that disparity in coverage. And someday this is going to be the subject of entire takedowns of kind of the late, it's the hangover of like the 20th century media establishment. They've been lingering on into the 21st century. And there are going to be entire books written about what they did during this era, their complicitness in it, just to try to stay relevant. I really, truly believe that. They're on their way out or into some other iteration or evolution. And in the process of doing so, they're actually helping to tear down the democracy that they claim to be a pillar of. And that's just heartbreaking and infuriating. One other thing I'm going to note, though, about the Trump rally is one of the songs that then Trump awkwardly swayed to was the rendition of the song Hallelujah by the artist Rufus Wainwright. Wainwright has been unhappy at Trump's use of his song, of his recording, and I believe has now done a cease and desist letter. There have been some of those from some other artists too, but we also saw lawsuits by other folks like the White Stripes. I'm just going to use this opportunity to issue another public service announcement to all musical artists out there and their representatives and their lawyers. Stop it with the cease and desist letters and actually sue. Actually sue. Don't do the cease and desist letter. He treats those like toilet paper that then is in a bathroom with classified documents that he is hiding from the feds. Pretty much literally, because he got a cease and desist letter effectively from the National Archives and from DOJ, where he was then, and we got a subpoena from DOJ. He got letters from the National Archives that were demanding him to cease hiding the documents that they knew he had, desist keeping them, and hand them over. And Donald Trump ignored those things. He doesn't care. And I can tell you straight up, having gone up against him in litigation, there is no way a request, a nice letter on lawyer letterhead. We did those too when we were trying to do the Trump University case. Please give us these records that we already subpoenaed from you and that you are still withholding from us, and we know it. Please, please. We would call them up and say, please, please. And what did they do? They screamed at us, and then I'm sure as soon as they got off the phone, they laughed about how idiotic and naive and foolish and weak we were. We finally managed to get the documents by other means, and then we made them stop laughing because we beat them. But the point is, you can't lawyer letter your way to a good legal outcome with Donald Trump. It does not exist. So these folks, musicians, many of whom I love, please, please, please stop sending cease and desist letters. I know it costs extra money, but get your lawyers to actually do a lawsuit. Okay. It's a bit more money, but it's worth it because that's how you'll actually get him to stop, maybe. And you'll be doing a good public service by sticking it to him in the meantime. And you should follow through with these things too. It's worth it. We need to stop him from misappropriating all of these artists' music. He keeps on stealing their music and using it in his damn rallies, and he doesn't ask permission. He doesn't pay royalties. It's theft, and it's on brand for him, of course. It's just more criming. It's just more thieving. Of course he's doing this. It's part of the grift. But we need to actually hold him to account, and the way to do that is not through a cease and desist letter. Please trust me on this one. I can say it from experience. Finally, we're going to wrap up talking about some really good news out of Georgia so far, and also what it means for November and how did we get here, what all these legal battles around elections and ballots are about. We're going to do that when we get back. Welcome back, and now we turn our attention to the great state of Georgia, where there were several big pieces of news that came out just within the last few days. One of them is we got the first court decision in what will probably be multiple different court decisions, almost certainly, regarding election law down there, where a judge in Fulton County in Atlanta issued a terrific opinion in which it was very clearly stated that certification of vote totals is not discretionary for officials like an election board, a local election superintendent, the Georgia Secretary of State. It is mandatory. If the math is there, they have to certify. They have to. It's not, oh, we have these vague, inchoate suspicions of fraud, and therefore we're just not going to certify. We have these allegations of fraud, and therefore we're not going to certify. They're not allowed to do that. And the Georgia court made that crystal clear. This is a very big win because a lot of it's akin to the VP Pence situation on J6. They want to do this all over the place with election officials all over the country to effectively say, look, we're going to place our own MAGA people in these roles, in these seats, and then they're just not going to do their jobs. And rather than issue the certification that they are required by law to issue, they're just not going to. And that will slow down the entire process, throw enough sand into the gears. And I'll explain sort of what the long game here is for them in a minute. But that's what they're trying to do here. And the Georgia court is saying, no, not so fast. There's more coming, where we got an indication then right after that from the same judge, where he was indicating in court some skepticism regarding the attempt by the Georgia State Board of Elections, which unfortunately now Donald Trump has managed to pack with 3 of his supporters, saying that the attempt to mandate statewide hand counting of ballots is too late, that it's too late in the process to actually make a big rule change like that, and that thereby a hint that probably is also not going to pass muster in the Georgia courts. We have to keep our fingers crossed that ends up being the case. One more thing that then creates the backdrop that we'll then discuss in greater detail is that yesterday, the 15th of October, as we're taping this on the 16th, the 15th of October was the first day of early voting in Georgia. And over 252,000 people voted on day one. That smashed the previous record of 136,000 that was established in 2020. Now, of course, you can't really go back much further than that because early voting, mail-in voting didn't exist very much until the last 5, 10, 20 years, pretty much anywhere. Very few states had more reform-minded, open systems for encouraging further voting turnout. There were a few, but not a whole lot. We've now seen greater increased access to ballots. Voting turnout has gone up as a result. Some of this was accelerated by COVID. There's a bigger story that we need to tell here. Okay, how did we get here? And what does it mean? Why is it a big deal that 252,000 versus 136,000 people voted early yesterday? Early voting, a lot of you know this, but just I think this is all very important for us to keep in mind. There's a full picture that I want to paint here for all of us. Early voting and mail-in voting now have a partisan lean. They skew heavily Democratic. This is in part because of Donald Trump. It's in large part because of Donald Trump and COVID. How did we get here? We've had absentee ballots for a long time, but for those, you had to state a reason. It wasn't just like, oh, because you feel like it. You actually had to vouch and sign under penalty of perjury that you were going to be out of state that day, for example. So it was something that plenty of people did, but it wasn't as widespread as now mail-in ballots have become, as early voting has become in a lot of places. What happened here, absentee ballots, if anything, had a bit of a Republican lean. The Republican electorate has for a long time skewed older, and seniors were more likely to rightfully request absentee ballots, claiming an inability to get to the polls, perhaps a mobility issue or a medical treatment scheduled for that day, something of that nature. And thereby, it was, if anything, absentee ballots were considered to be slightly Republican leaning, sometimes more than slightly. Historically, thereby, the Republican Party tended to be very pro access to absentee ballots because it marginally helped them electorally as opposed to the Democrats. But COVID and Trump changed all of that. Specifically, the fact that we saw suddenly a partisan lean between the two positions of, I'm going to stay at home and be safe and try not to, and try to stop the spread, as we all remember calling it a few years ago during the pandemic, versus everything's fine, I'm going to go out and not wear a mask and cough on people and it's great. The contrast between those two worldviews, which then Donald Trump was exploiting to the hilt in the 2020 election, explains a lot of how we got here, and we just all have to remember that. Folks who wanted to stay home because they were worried about COVID wanted to vote earlier so that the lines were more spread out, rather than huge lines on election day. Hey, this early voting period is 2 weeks long, and I can pick kind of a random moment in the late morning or something like that one day. It's like 11 a.m. and almost nobody's here, and I get to stroll in and cast my ballot, as opposed to long lines on election day. Or better yet, do a mail-in ballot, and I avoid all of that, and I don't have to go out and risk getting sick. The Republican Trumper MAGA worldview there instead was, hell no, I'm just going to go and show up at the polling place like I normally do. That meant that you had a disproportionate number of the mail-in and early ballots going to Democrats. And then that left anybody who had voted early, of course, then doesn't need to vote on election day. So they're not there. So the people who are left over, who are voting in person on election day, are now, in most places, a little bit disproportionately, sometimes a lot disproportionately, Republican. So now it's created this very weird dynamic where there's a partisan tinge to what type of method of voting that you prefer and push for. And so that explains why we're seeing all of these problems. We kind of have to remember that and bear it in mind. So now Republicans are trying to squash access to early voting. They're trying to squash drop boxes. They're trying to squash access to mail-in ballots. They want to stop those things from happening as much as possible. It also colored how Donald Trump handled the 2020 election and the January 6th conspiracy, where Trump and other folks like Steve Bannon were championing the idea that, well, we're just going to declare victory on or shortly after Election Day. Why? Why were they saying that? They were confident, and they turned out to be right, that Donald Trump would have a lead in a lot of places right after Election Day, but he would not hold them. Because once those mail-in ballots and early ballots were counted, that apparent early lead from the election day in-person voting would be counteracted and potentially completely eliminated. And that is, in fact, what happened in many places like Georgia and like Pennsylvania. A lot of these states, Donald Trump looked like he was up after election night in the couple of days that followed that. And as all of those other ballots got counted, the lead shrank and then reversed, and Biden won. That drove a lot of their activity at that time. It drove a lot of what the whole big lie ended up being about, this notion that, oh, the mail-in ballots are fraud. Oh, the early ballots are fraud. The drop boxes are fraud. They're not then running around and saying that the in-person election is fraud necessarily, although sometimes it carried off to that too. But what they were really doing is trying to find specifically the Democratic areas of support, methods of voting, but also places of voting, right? They really fixated on Fulton County because Fulton County is where the bulk of Atlanta sits, and Atlanta leans heavily Democratic. So they were really, really picking on places like Fulton County or like the city of Philadelphia or the city of Detroit. When you heard Donald Trump talk about voter fraud, when you heard Rudy Giuliani talk about it, they would fixate on the cities. Okay, that was also a racial dog whistle there, by the way. When they're saying Atlanta, Detroit, Philadelphia, that was definitely part of what they were doing there too. But they wanted to squish those vote totals, throw out those ballots in a place or in a manner that tends to go more Democratic than not, preserving the Republican voting turnout while restricting the Democratic vote turnout. That is the animating principle behind the entire legal and political strategy around voting and elections that Trump and MAGA, all of these folks, have been espousing. Okay. And we're going to see it in the courts. We're going to see it in rhetoric. We're going to see it in how he approaches things on TV. We're going to see it probably in him. Will he declare victory again on or just after election night this time in 2024? Maybe we're going to see the same phenomenon again. We don't know. Is he probably freaking out right now that we're seeing not just the voting totals in Georgia, where you see this huge additional wave of first day early voting, but the requests for mail-in ballots, as well as lines and turnout for early voting, have also been setting new records all across the country in the last couple of weeks. These are very bad signs for Donald Trump because it is very clear that a higher turnout election is probably not going to go in his favor. The more people turn out, the more likely it is that Harris and the Democrats are going to win, and potentially not just win the presidency, but also then win a lot of key House and Senate races in the battle for control of Congress. So that's the backdrop to a lot of what you're seeing here. So what were they trying to do in Georgia? The Trump people were trying to say, oh yeah, well, they haven't succeeded at managing to kill early voting. They haven't succeeded at managing to kill mail-in ballots. They're going to try to see what they can do to mess with or question or disparage the legitimacy of the voting in a place like Fulton County that, again, goes heavily Democratic. But what they're doing now is kind of a fallback option is something like this. Well, if we can't actually get rid of the mail-in ballots, and we can't get rid of the early ballots, and we can't get rid of the ballots coming from heavily Democratic areas, then at least we can just say that the vote is not going to get certified at all. Either we delay it or we get our people to just refuse to take action, right? Or to do something other than what their ceremonial legal role requires. They wanted Mike Pence to question and refuse to certify the vote on January 6th last time. They want lots of little situations like this where so-and-so member of a board of elections, so-and-so election superintendent, so-and-so secretary of state refuses to engage in their ceremonial duty to sign something that has numbers on it when those numbers have not been successfully challenged and have not been stopped by a court. At that point, unless a judge has come in and said, we need to recount or we need to do something else, then it's that official's job to sign the damn paper. That's their job. That's what Georgia just upheld. So Trump isn't going to be able to get away with that one quite as easily, although I'm sure he's going to be trying. We'll probably see some more court action on this in Georgia. It's something that he's undoubtedly going to be trying to do in other states. Then there's this other thing of like, okay, let's just delay the whole thing. We'll just lengthen the period of time that it takes to do all of the counting so that the legal and constitutional deadlines cannot be met. And then it potentially takes certain localities, certain states out of play entirely. That appears to be what they were trying to do, the Trump folks in Georgia, with the hand count rule. So by saying like, oh yeah, we've got to actually count every single ballot in Georgia by hand. Georgia's a big state. This is no small thing to do that, okay? It's not California or Texas or Florida, but it's one of the larger states in the country now. If you require a hand recount of every single ballot in the state, the odds that you're going to be able to get everything done in time for the Electoral College needs to meet. That's December 14th, usually. And then January 6th is the constitutionally prescribed time when the Electoral College vote is to be certified by Congress. That will be true again this time. It will be the 6th of January. That is required by the Constitution. If those deadlines are not met, we risk not having a officially certified winner of the election of the Electoral College, at which point we run a risk that the election will get thrown into the House of Representatives as is prescribed by the Constitution. That is, as far as I can tell here, the end game that they're trying for here. It may actually be already laid out in some John Eastman memo. You know, he might still be writing these memos, even though he's getting disbarred here and indicted there. Like, they may still be looking to him as the legal mastermind that will help us get through all of this. But whatever crazy right-wing insurrectionist lawyer who's risking disbarment and imprisonment that they've managed to find to do all of this, who's put together some new memo. You know, this time it's not fake electors and trying to pressure Mike Pence. This time it's this other stuff. They're coming up with these other schemes to try to make the election not happen. Again, what they're effectively saying is, well, if we can't actually beat her, then we're just going to make sure that no one wins. And then they're going to try to push it into the House. And as I've already stated before, what happens then is that each state gets one vote. That House delegation then decides they have to vote amongst themselves to pick who's going to be the recipient of that state's one vote in the House. And that will be the newly elected House, which again puts a high premium on what happens in the House election. If they tie then there, it actually goes to the Senate, where, get this, they don't choose among the two top of the ticket people. They actually choose from among the top three vice presidential candidates. That's right. It would mean that then if it is say it's a Republican Senate, a Republican Senate could then declare J.D. Vance to be president of the United States. So that would be, if you have a 25-25 tie over in the House, it would then go to the Senate. So the Senate is also going to be hugely important. Who wins the Senate? Which senators are sworn in on January 2nd and thereby are there to do the voting for president in a constitutional crisis in January if it gets that far? That is what Donald Trump is trying to engineer. He's trying to create a situation whereby even if he loses all of the big swing states, or most of them, and Kamala Harris has clearly achieved an electoral college victory, he is trying to make it such that there just won't be an electoral college victor, and he throws it into a constitutional crisis on Capitol Hill that he is somehow hoping he can finagle or send another mob to go disrupt and influence and threaten. That seems to be what the strategy is from what we can tell right now. And Georgia, thankfully, is at least looking like there's going to be some judicial decisions to pump the brakes on this. But we have to hope that the judiciary holds solid and does not fall prey to any of these conspiratorial efforts, any of these wild, crazy, anti-constitutional insurrectionist schemes to try to steal an election that Donald Trump looks increasingly unlikely to be able to win outright, fairly, right? All of this, of course, becomes moot if he can somehow pull off a win, and I, for one, am praying that he doesn't. But it's crystal clear that regardless of who you support, the election should be decided by the voters and not by these kind of crazy illegal schemes to find some workaround to win the election when you didn't actually win the election. But Donald Trump is at it again, And Georgia is looking like, again, one of those battlegrounds that are going to be very important for this. Thankfully, we did get some good news. Something else to bear in mind as we head toward November. That was our show. Thank you so much for listening. If you liked what you heard, please make sure you follow this podcast so you get all of the latest episodes automatically downloaded to your devices. And that includes our great series, Decoding Project 2025, which is getting to its conclusion. We're going to wrap up before Election Day, I hope. And that's continuing as well. We're going to also be making sure to provide all of the latest, greatest information on my Twitter and on my Substack. So make sure that you are following me on Twitter, subscribing for free to my Substack, and we'll see you next time.